there was a presentation showing a slide of the medals table from the 1912 Olympics. And I looked at it and did some elaboration on it. Oh, just get it the right way. And I put it into groups: the Scandinavian countries, the States, rest of the world, and Great Britain and the Commonwealth. And so that Scandinavia was quite a sporting power at the time, leaving the rest of the way behind. I have to admit the Swedes were the better ones, but I won't go deep into that. So Denmark was quite a sporting nation at an early stage. Yet in Denmark, we do not have a sports museum. And a couple of years ago, when one of the leading curators at the National Museum of Denmark was writing an article on sports and museums, said that they would take in some sporting items if they could tell a story about a proper topic, such as gender relations. But in itself, it was not interesting. We didn't have any sports history until the 1980s, and when we finally got some, the focus was on gymnastics rather than sports. And Denmark had been fighting professionalism right from the late 19th century. And it was so that until 1971, if a footballer played professional football abroad, he was ineligible for the Danish national team. So we've been holding this amateurism stance for quite a long time. And even the term sport, we're not particularly happy with it. We prefer quite often the Nordic term idræt instead. And if you look at these terms, what's the difference? Well, sometimes people will use it for the same thing. But if there is a tendency, it is that sport is competition as an end in itself, whereas idræt quite often serves a higher purpose. And the difference in this attitude perhaps is best served by a quotation from a Danish paper prior to the First World War, quite often used in books, regarding an athletics meeting between England and Finland. The newspaper said, the English had only one thing in mind: to get over the bar no matter how they did it. They didn't hide the pains their efforts cost them, and they left the crowd with the impression that certain tricks were necessary to jump the highest. They positioned themselves at irregular angles to the bar, made strangely curved run-ups to the jump. They curled their bodies up in the middle of the jump before landing on both hands and feet. The Finns, on the contrary, made a straight run-up, straightened themselves out in the middle of the jump before landing elegantly upright, looking as though they had hardly had to make an effort to jump 3 yards. And I think that sums up the difference between idræt and sport quite well. So why is it that Danes, even though they did quite well, have been somehow reluctant and hesitant to really embrace sport? And as I've been telling my colleagues several times during the week, if you want to explain something peculiarly Danish, you have to go back to 1864. Think of 1066, double it, and add some more. Then you have what 1864 means to Danes. Denmark used to be a unitarian, absolutist state, consisting of Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, and the German duchies Schleswig and Holstein. And for some reason we never count the Atlantic islands. But in 1814, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark first lost Norway. And when Denmark got a democratic constitution in 1848, it led to tension between the Danish and the German-speaking elements, resulting in a civil war. The German element lost it, but it reignited in 1864, and the German part got help from Prussia and Austria, and the two duchies were added to the new German Empire. And as people said in Denmark, Denmark was amputated by the hips. We lost so much, and it was at a time when Darwinism was beginning to come into prominence, and people wondered what it took to survive as a state in the competition. And suddenly people saw, well, Denmark is becoming smaller and smaller, and now we're about to disappear. And that led to a very strong moral movement trying to reignite Denmark as a state. There was so much innovation and creativity in the aftermath of 1864 And to mention just 3 things, people started cultivating the moors. The slogan was outward loss, inward gain, so we lost land, we'll just cultivate some new to compensate. The entire agricultural production was rearranged, so we started to deliver the traditional English breakfast, bacon, butter and eggs. The entire agricultural sector was geared to that. From being grain exporting, Denmark became grain importing to feed the pigs. The number rose from 400,000 to 2.5 million. Same applied for cattle, and ways of feeding the cattle meant that they produced 3 times as much milk. So there was a lot of things going on in that area as well as several others. And there was an enlightenment movement to help make the peasant population active democratic citizens who would fight for the survival of the state. With the Danish folk high schools situated around in the countryside, educating grown-up peasants at the core of it, developing a sort of Christian nationalism. And that's why Denmark, although we don't think of it as Danes, Denmark is a very nationalistic state. You'll find Danish flags, Danish symbols everywhere if you go there. This unity, trying to survive, also had another aspect. There was a big political divide inside the state, and the main issue was how to defend the country. One element was this cultural defense of the folk high school, that even if the Germans come, we will make sure that Danish nationalism will survive. But the big political issue was whether to have a fortification of Copenhagen. The peasants' movement said we should have the people in arms who are ready to fight when the Germans come, whereas the conservative element said, no, we will make a last stand in Copenhagen for the king, so we are to build a fortification of Copenhagen. The peasants' party were in the majority in parliament, but the government was conservative, and they made provisional laws financing the building of a fortification. And that really led to a very big political conflict between about the fortification of Copenhagen. And when it started in the mid-1880s, there was even an assassination attempt on the Prime Minister, creating more tension between the peasant side, folk high school movement, and the conservative movement around Copenhagen. This conflict was finally resolved in 1901 with the introduction of parliamentary sovereignty, and you could say that the wound from 1964 was partly healed in 1920 when Denmark got part of the duchies back after the end of the First World War. But it's within this chronological framework that sport develops in Denmark, with 1864 right until 1920, leading to this struggle for survival. How can we create citizens who are strong enough to fight for it? And in between, from 1885 and 1901, there is this political divide. Should it be the people in arms, or should it be the aristocratic governed army? That's the core of the military. So when sports history finally was taken up by a scholar, Ove Korsgaard, it's usually translated the fight for the body. I don't think it quite gets it, but I'll use the official translation of his title. The story was about German gymnastics being introduced to the school and the army after the defeat in 1814. But the folk high school movement picked up Swedish gymnastics from 1884, and there was this fight between the conservatives who wanted to keep the German gymnastics and the folk high school movements with the stronghold Asker Højskole promoting the Swedish gymnastics that displayed the unity among the peasant population that was necessary to fight the conservative elements, as well as being proper for and developing nationalist discourse. At the same time, shooting societies started to develop, mainly after 1864, and after a few years the interest dwindled a bit, but when the political conflict surfaced in the 1880s, shooting societies became prominent again. And there you had them in the countryside, where they combined it with the Swedish gymnastics. It was seen as rebellious by the army. They also wanted to make drills with the members so they could serve as an army, whereas the conservative shooting societies preferred the German gymnastics and said, we won't do any drills, we are just preparing people to go into the army, led by the conservative officers. So there's this, again, very political element to Swedish German gymnastics and the way shooting societies should operate. And in this picture, well, sport didn't fit in, it didn't serve a purpose. So Korsgaard says that was just an urban phenomenon for those who were just pursuing their own business interest. They could find this in the competitive element of sport. So the rest of the entire countryside and the folk high school movement rejected the sports, is his thesis. Especially in 1888, sport became prominent in Copenhagen and it spread to other cities, is his argument. This framework from 1982 has been, research framework, has been very dominant. Some people have tried to prove it wrong, but they have been led by the questions focusing on the gymnastics and the shooting societies. Very few have succeeded in getting out of it. One of those who did so, Niels Kaiser Nielsen, a researcher, he tried to explain why did we become trapped up in this in the 1980s, and he said it developed because it was in the aftermath of the 70s students' movements, where there was still a skepticism of growth society paired with skepticism of state control, and researchers went looking for examples of empowerment and grassroots organization in the past to explain where should we go from here after the students' movement had sort of failed. So what they went looking for, the sports historians, was the perfect sportsman in shape of the democratic peasant fighting aristocratic and undemocratic noble and businessmen, as well as a conservative state power. And the purpose of this was to obtain liberty, equality, democracy, and get the land back from Germany. And the tools were the Swedish gymnastics and shooting. This fitted in with the general story that people used to look at Danish history with. Sport didn't really fit into this framework. So sporting activity in the countryside, that doesn't fit in, so it was more or less ignored. And therefore, it became so predominantly seen as an urban phenomenon. That's the thesis of this critic, Niels Kaiser Nielsen. And he has tried to show instead that it was not just an urban phenomenon. What was specific to sport was that it appealed to the young and progressive because it had some elements that were beginning to develop in the Danish society, but were not predominant. The Danish society was still very patriarchal. Sport offered, he said, equality. You had to compete by the same rules, so there were nobody who were privileged in the competition. It offered freedom to do some certain things, to play, to pursue your own success, and it also had freedom from other things, such as authority, from military, from parents, and other things. It was freedom in the term that it was often pursued in open air, and very importantly, he stresses, it was a place where youth counts. At that time, the electoral age in Denmark was 30. You couldn't vote, you didn't have anything to say. It was the parents, more or less, who set you up financially if you wanted to move away from your home. And you normally would follow in the trade of your parents. That was breaking up at the time of the late 19th century. And he saw sport as something that really synthesized this. Suddenly it was possible to obtain loans to buy your own house, so you didn't rely on your parents. There was still this electoral thing, but here on the sports field, you could really express your youth, and it counted. And that, he says, is part of the reason why many of the conservatives and from the folk high school movement, the older people, were a bit anxious about the sporting movement. It sort of threatened their authority. To make this the point about the folk high school movement rejecting sport, Korsgaard uses a quotation from the headmaster of the main folk high school, Korsgaard. And he has said in a major speech, in economy, solidarity is predominant in all the cooperative industries in Denmark these days. That were peasant cooperatives. Beside it, you find competition and the free market. Those two are equally important. Within the sphere of bodily exercise, the same applies. So solidarity and competition are both important. But it's probably a good thing that they have been allocated separate arenas, the gym for the former and the sporting field for the latter. But that doesn't rule out that male gymnastics now and again can be livened up by some sports elements. And Korsgaard uses this to show that the folk high school movement push away sport. To me it says, well, they are different things, but we can see the use of the competitive elements, and even in the gymnastics that we promote, it might be a good idea sometimes to put it in. I don't think that you can read a total rejection of sport out of this. I think that she says it has to exist side by side. They promote different virtues. So it's still a bit like this idræt terms. It has to serve a higher purpose. People have to be competitive so the country can develop, but they also have to learn solidarity. So that's the element you can say is in it as I see it. And in fact, Niels Kaiser Nielsen showed that just in the town neighboring this folk high school, the main one, they got the first successful football team outside Copenhagen, delivering the first international player to the Danish national team. And he points out that many of the players work in industry plants in this town. They were employed because of their footballing skills, and the owner of this industry, he also supported the folk high school. I can show there's a link the other way around. The son of the only son of the headmaster of this folk high school, he chose to be a farmer, got the farm next to the folk high school, and he went into the football club, becoming what you in English probably would call assistant manager. And farmhands at the farm were employed for their footballing skills, and up to matches, all the squad were gathered at the farm to prepare for it. And he went on to become only the 12th person to obtain the highest accolade in the Football Association, where he went later. You can say that having this young man, it just proves that it was something rebellious about sport, that he was doing it against the folk high school ideology. But from what I know, and this is my grandfather, there was never any conflict with his roots. They didn't see it as a conflict. It was just natural to go on to sport. So again, there are many indications that this split, pushing the sport into the urban framework, and seeing gymnastics and shooting societies as the main thing for the folk high school movement, which consisted of the majority of the population, is a false one, created very much by researchers' questions. Then you can argue, why is this still the case, that we haven't really broken out? There's been these single scholars who have questioned it, but it's never really caught on the sports history. And one of the reasons, I think, is the way research is funded in Denmark. Nowadays, research funding is increasingly reliant on major political focus areas. You have to, all your applications have to fit into big multi-million government areas of focus. And these areas are such things as citizenship, democratic values and institutions, it has to do something with health. You know, they're not really interested in things that can challenge this work. So you don't get anybody really applying for a big thing to challenge it. It becomes minor articles where people spot something and it never really catches on. So that is my conclusion, that we have the end of my talk, that in Denmark we are so much tied up with this from 1864, the development of democratic citizens, and we have very big difficulties breaking out of it. So,
thank you.